Hello, hello. My name is Denise Onen, and I'm really glad to be presenting today and sharing what has been a very useful tool in my creative practices as a sound designer and composer, and the framework and models and wonderful world of sonic semiotics. And I hope that it will enrich your creative processes as much as it has helped mine. Before I dive into all of that, I just want to say a word of thanks to everyone who's made Boat Electrons possible, as well as all the contributors and everyone who's just contributing to this wonderful world of music technology. And thank you to Theo Herbst and Matthew Pratt as well. Alrighty. Designing sounds with meaning. So semiotics, semiosis, semantics, all of these words have to do with meaning and conveying meaning and the logic systems that deal with signs and symbols. I'm going to start off by showing you these two logos. And the thing about them is you can probably hear them even though you're looking at them. And they in themselves as logos are a sign, a symbol, a signifier of sorts, of something else. And being able to hear them is an interesting phenomenon because someone decided we're going to attach a sound to that. And now we associate meaning with those signs. And even if you were to hear the sounds associated with those signs without the logos actually being there, you know exactly which brand that's representing. And that being executed so well across borders, different forms of entertainment, different tastes, is because of a really good execution of semiotics. It would be rather incorrect for me to call that an execution of semiotics, but rather it's part of the process of semiosis. And that deals with signs and symbols and the way we attach meaning to the things, the way we ascribe meaning to things. And that influences our understanding. If you think of it, composers translate emotions and sound designers convey meanings or hint towards things that have been left out of the picture or are suggested. And the way this land depends on how exactly that is being communicated or played. And semiosis and semiotics, which is the study of signs and symbols, is all about communication. Because within that exchange that's taking place, there is a creator of a product of some sort, whether it's your composer, your producer, your sound designer. There is a process that happens with this message that is being conveyed, and on the other hand, you have the recipient or the receiver. And due to differences in cultural backgrounds or environments, that's going to impact how that message is received or interpreted. So understanding the in-betweens when this process is taking place can better inform how to engage in more intentional communication. And that's the kind of thing that's key to really good sound design, actually. Maybe being a better composer, if it's the case where you want to actually have better engagement or evoke more emotion from your listeners, or in terms of marketing, how to better reach your target market or be memorable because of sound. And just as a disclaimer, I've been working with a lot of film and documentary sound design, so that's also informed the lens with which I approach adding meaning to my practice as a sound designer. how is the listener, viewer, recipient on the other end actually going to be able to better receive whatever is visually taking place, and also what is the overall sonic world that is being built. So, as much as I'm giving you a crash course in sonic semiotics, my aim here is to actually give you a critical model on how to think about making sound and music more meaningful for whoever is going to be listening to it, hearing it, viewing it, receiving it on the other end. So what we'll be looking at is I'll touch a little bit on the history, and there are a few terms and definitions that we're going to get familiar with so that one is able to take this and apply this to their practice. Psychologically, our thought apart from its expression in words is only a shapeless and indistinct mass. Semiotics is a massive field, and this quote is by Ferdinand de Saussure, who is credited as the father of linguistics and co-founder of semiotics, the other credited founder being Charles Sanders Peirce. I really like this quote because it touches on how mentally, or in this case psychologically, we have these thoughts in our heads, which are these symbols, signs, it could be text, it could be these mental images that we experience and perceive within ourselves. And through expressing them in communication, we give them form, and it takes place and happens in this way that whoever's on the other side of the receiving end of that expression interprets it in their own way, and depending on how we say these things and constructs them, maybe there's metaphors or idioms, or whichever which way it's said is going to determine how that is received. And so signs and symbols take various shapes and forms, which is why semiotics in itself is a massive field, yes, rooted in linguistics. And one might ask, why on earth would a linguistic framework be used to analyze music? But language is something that is complex and takes so many different shapes and forms. But in itself is also a system of signs and symbols, just like music. And with the way we construct our sentences and put words together, with the way we combine chords, it all creates different kinds of meanings, different kinds of emotions are evoked from whatever is expressed and the way that takes place. Linked to this list of linguists, philosophers, semioticians, and musicologists, I've focused on these select few because they are linked to the, could I say, school of thought, or the frameworks and models that have been very useful for music and audio practices. Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, created codal codes, which I'll speak of later. He speaks about messages and these expressions as codes, taking specific forms as signs, indexes, and symbols. And this notion of the sign, the signified, and the signifier. And knowing the difference between those things can really help with picking what symbols could be used or integrated into one's work to enhance it and increase its means of expression. Musical meaning relies on non-linguistic systems such as signs and indexes. While these may not be as steady or specific as language, they communicate shared meaning just the same. Another quote I find very interesting, as many have a tendency to romanticize music as a language. And music in itself is a language because it is a means of communication, but it also uses such a unique set of signs and symbols and combinations of these things to share meaning, but not in the same way language does. And with using frameworks like this, there's always the question of why overanalyze, why speculate, always going into the theoretical frameworks, why do this kind of thing? The thing about analysis is it gives us mechanisms for finding meaning and increasing the depth of our understanding, which in turn advances works and to the benefit of the field and the practices. But there is a danger in getting caught in these speculative rabbit holes and theories, which is why even in semiotics itself, because it's such a broad field, there is conflict about terms between semioticians. And that's why I've also specifically chosen to focus on Peirce's models and these Peircean modes and sets of definitions. So to just get you familiar with some of the terms, we've got signs, icons, and indexes. And a lot of these things we already know what they are in general everyday life because we communicate. We just don't have this prescribed language for them. So your sign would be an object or a thing, a signifier, whether it is an actual physical sign, like a stop sign, an image, or a sound, which is an indicator, and the signified, which is that mental concept you experience when it's received, the mental image that pops up because someone says the red, and you think of the color red. But red in itself could be a signifier of maybe, is it danger? Is it the color? Is it blood? What might it be? And that's where it's important to be specific, because between individuals, and of course context dependent, meaning changes. And that's why this notion of intentional communication keeps coming back. So icons would resemble the signified. That would be something like an X-ray. It's a representation, but it's not exactly that thing, but you know what it is an icon of. And an index is connected to the signifier. So it would kind of be like smoke, alluding to a fire, which is the actual object or the thing. It's where it starts getting a little bit more abstract. It's removed, but you know what it's associated with. Now that there's some familiarity with the terms icon, index, symbol, sign, signifier, which you don't have to have completely down, we'll come back to it. As these things are abstract, as long as one has a concept, it's still useful. We've got this Peircean model of communication, where you have a transmitter, channel, receiver, and a response. So the transmitter is your creator, the composer, sound design, musician, just the one of that who is creating the content. And they have with them this message or expression or code that is to be communicated. And this is the channel. That is the coded message, the what. And on the other hand, you have the receiver, who is anybody who is hearing it. And that includes the transmitter. And on the other end, the outcome is the response, the feeling. What emotion is evoked? What is the reaction? Is there a memory being jogged? Is there an embodied experience? What is the result of the person hearing this? And this model is broken down into different parts because it's where the transmitter and the receiver either have an agreement and understanding, or there is a lack of understanding, or there is just not shared resources in terms of background or meeting ground, where things get lost in translation. And Peirce has different names for this. So there is codal incompetence, where one could think of it as maybe it's incompetence on the part of the transmitter, because as the creator, they should make the effort to inquire as to what the, let's say, vocabulary or understanding of the language or background or musical norms of their receivers might be. So codal incompetence occurs when the transmitter and the receiver don't have the same vocabulary or musical symbols. But there's also the case of codal interference, where a transmitter and receiver may actually have the same store of musical symbols and the same vocabulary, but due to different cultural norms or experiences, there is, again, that loss in translation. And examples of this, we have codal incompetence, where there is a lack of the shared vocabulary or symbols. A good example of that would be between generations, where because of different environments, living circumstances, a whole gap of several years, it's literally like speaking a different language, sort of like how we might not understand the lingo of Gen Z, or people might refer to music of the olden days and not necessarily have any sort of connection with it. Is that because so much time has passed or circumstances, it's nearly like speaking a different language. And that tends to happen with the way these signs and symbols evolve throughout time, why genres are forever changing and evolving. Because we as people are ever changing, and that means the way we communicate, the way we might think or experience things is also changing, and we need to be aware of that. Codal interference would be where the transmitter and receiver do have the same basic store of music symbols and vocabulary. So there is an understanding, but the thing is, there may be differing cultural norms. And the reason why expectations is in that sentence as well is because it may actually also just come down to taste. Someone just not liking the music because it was not what they were exposed to, it's not what they're familiar with. They may have heard it, but it's just not their genre. So just again with this model, the transmitter, the channel of the coded message which is being transmitted, the receiver who hears it, and the response, which is the reaction. Encoded messages is in semiotics, codes are linked to cultural conventions. These are those signs and symbols and just notions that are just agreed upon in a wide sense. An abstract example of that would be in classrooms in school when papers are marked. A tick is an agreement, a correct answer, whereas a cross is when something is wrong. Other cultural conventions could be linked to color schemes, like red being, there to alert you or there's danger, or music, how a minor chord is associated with sadness. When even teaching kids theory, a major chord is happy and the minor chord is sad, or a major seventh might be dreamy. And even though these codes and conventions might be the case at some point in time, they can and do change over time and vary between geographies, cultures, and even between individuals. But in that sense, that just has to do with cultural specifics. But that would just be where it's nuanced. And now that all of these signs, signifiers, codes, conventions, and all of that have been touched on, I can actually move into now speaking about how exactly this all falls into sound and music. So I just made a list of these signs and symbols, and what they might actually just signify or evoke. What might be the response to them? What are the associated meanings, and how does knowing what those are inform creative processes and cultural conventions? So reading about this in semiotics, it actually made me think of genres nearly like sonic stereotypes, because it's based on certain characteristics, meter, rhythm, instruments, that we put them within these categories. But genres tend to change and evolve based on other elements that might be introduced into it. And that's sometimes informed by social and cultural conventions. So just to return to this, so musically and sound, the accordion is often associated with French music, banjos with country music, and any old-time cartoon or Looney Tunes or anything from back in the day tends to use what I would call these sonic stereotypes. If you hear a cock crowing, you know that it's morning or daybreak. And sleigh bells are a signifier for Christmas and the festive season. Something like the sitar as an instrument is interesting because to some it might be a symbol for an icon, being Ravi Shankar, or you can make them think of the Beatles, who once again what I was speaking to in terms of genre, and these sonic conventions, raga rock becoming a thing because of, if I'm not mistaken, George Harrison learning the sitar from Ravi Shankar and using it in quite a few songs. And later on, this single instrument being synonymous with, if you want to make anything sound psychedelic, or if it sounded like the sound of a movement for hippies and that sort of liberation of the mind movement. And when it comes to sound design, if you want to create a sense of urgency in the most subtle way, and this has probably been used for the longest time in many different ways, shapes and forms and films, if there is a room and there are people having a conversation, whatever the case might be, ticking will always create a sense of urgency. And if it happens to be an environment where it would make sense for a kitchen to be nearby, one could use the sound of a whistling kettle. Even though most of us these days tend to have digital clocks and electric kettles as opposed to stove kettles and ticking clocks, we'll always associate that with the passing of time, and with that a sense of urgency, and it never gets cliche because it's just so natural. And that also just touches on why subtlety is so important when it comes to sound design. Another sign of symbol, just the last one there, is 8-bit music. And depending on your timeline, you might associate that with your early gaming consoles, and specifically Atari. And the younger generation might associate that with, not necessarily younger generation, but again, Gen Z, chiptune music, which is a whole genre that came about using 8-bit sounds. And this is once again, just to go back to how understanding these nuances of what instruments we have just learned to associate with places, what emotions we associate with certain sounds, objects, things, can really help with creating a world, building a world, hinting towards something, and broadening that inclusivity and experience within music, and just creating more of a well thought out experience, because these are the little details that may help. And to also deviate from, let's say, falling into these cliches. So these codes and conventions can really give us insight to what people's internal vocabulary for these things might already be, and how we can better speak their language, or maybe speak in a way that might appeal to them more. And this is where your audio logos come in. So earlier I showed you the Netflix logo and the MGM lion, and it's just a random fun fact is that lion survived a plane crash, but I will not deviate. The McDonald's logo, the ba-da-ba-ba-ba, I'm loving it. And with Coca-Cola, what was interesting is in some cases there was the sound of a can being opened, and in other cases there was the sound of a bottle being opened. And the thing about that is, in terms of varying cultural norms, a bottle opening might be associated with alcohol as opposed to just a non-alcoholic beverage, which is why it may have been better to use a can being open in certain regions. And this is where knowing one's receiver, target market audience at the end of the day really comes in handy in terms of honing in these things. These days your audio logos tend to be a lot shorter, like the Intel Inside that was around 5 notes, and our Netflix is 2 notes with a long tail. I would play these for you, but I don't want to come into any problems with copyright infringements. But the 1990s and early 2000s were a time where there was a lot more use of audio logos and jingles. And now that's translated to having more of your signature sounds in your everyday apps and usage, and just having audio branding as a whole. There's a growing field in audio branding because we've moved away from jingles with people's shortening attention spans, especially with faster media and just the way the pace of things has changed. I guess this is one of those ways when it comes to keeping up with signs and signifiers and all of this. One needs to keep with the people and the times. And outside of audio logos, I'd just like to bring your attention to other ways and forms that sound is used to be associated with brands, like hearing Siri's voice. One will know that it's an iPhone or some sort of Apple product. Alexa is associated with Google. The Skype ringtone is literally the Skype tone. And these kinds of things we hear and we know, and we're already associated with a brand. Everyone knows exactly what it is, and it just has this universal meaning that is widely understood. Unless, of course, the voice is in a different language. And that's when things begin to change. And once again, it's that thing of understanding cultural conventions and differences between people and catering to different ways of communication to make these things more meaningful, and how audio can do that rather than having an auto-generated virtual assistant, having an actual voiceover artist that's recorded to meet that same, let's say, timbre or quality that the English voice may have. And once again, this is just those little things and those details that go a long way. And an audio production with producers, how having audio branding and taglines has been quite useful is a big name that is now just circulating. Well, not now, it's been around for quite a few years, but DJ Khaled and his lines like "we're the best," and another one you'll hear people saying, especially on social media, and how fast things go around there, and Jason Derulo singing his name at the beginning of every one of his tracks. A lot of producers Also, a lot of South African house producers for years have been saying the names of their production houses, or they have some sort of signifier of their production house at the beginning of the song. And it's these kinds of taglines that create that sense of memory and association, and is a clever way of using audio to build a brand or market oneself. And just to tie everything together, as I said, semiotics is an incredibly broad field, and even with having it rooted in music and exploring sonic semiotics, it is still quite a lot to unpack in terms of icons, symbols, signs, signifiers, which is all the case. But I'd like to bring it all together by using an example of how it's been used in music production, and how it's a very clever and creative way to add just an extra something to music that's being made, and how everyday sounds can be incorporated into music in this clever way. And so, if we were to take money as a concept, the signifier of money, the icons, the indexes, and all the things that would point towards money, resemble it, allude to it, would be coins, paper notes, your paper bank notes, banks themselves, a dollar bill, the ka-ching sound, gold bars, money bags, dollar signs on money bags. And looking at what money could potentially symbolize, all those things could be obviously the generation of income, capitalism, the rat race, work, employment, hustle culture, all of these things. And a chosen signifier for money I'd like to highlight is a cash register. Coins, banks, dollar bills, any of those things could have been a signifier. But the sound of a cash register is something that is known pretty much universally and across time lines. So the songs I'm going to refer to, which once again I'm not going to play because of copyright infringement, are Money by Pink Floyd and Paper Planes by MIA. Both songs use the sound of the cash register, and both are speaking about money in different contexts, but the way in which it's been used is, if you were to Google songs that have the sound of a cash register, these will be the top results. MIA is a bit different because there's the sound of a cash register and gunshots, which had to be censored in some versions. But then again, it's using an everyday sound to enhance meaning in music. It also just adds an extra layer of something different and creative. And even though those are songs and music in themselves, it's such an interesting way of looking at it, because now someone else could think, if they're writing a song about a certain topic, how can I enhance this meaning and enrich the experience for the listener, but just communicate even more depth than I could before? And being able to think about what signifies what I'm speaking about, what does it symbolize and stand for, and what can I choose as a signifier that can represent that in a way that a lot of people will understand, is a great way to add depth of meaning and enhance one's practice. I hope that through all of this, you may have gained a better understanding of how semiotics and signs and symbols, and looking at different ways we may vary in our understanding of signs and symbols, and how to engage with that. That is a great way of diving into another's world and fostering a better understanding in practice of how to communicate. Thank you so much.